Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Strange, Dark, and Related podcast. I am your host, Elfie. And as always, I have the Relateds with me. Today, we actually have a very interesting episode to share with you all. But we are going to start with our question of the day. The question of the day is, do you like tea? If so, what is your favorite? And if not, why not? So, as I mentioned, my name is Elfie. I do like tea. I am not a fan of herbal teas. I found that they're okay. I'll drink it if that's the only thing to drink. I will not drink chamomile. Don't like that. But I really do like black teas. That's my favorite. And then green teas to pair with food. I can drink black tea like anytime, but green tea, I like to pair it with food. But yeah, that is my favorite.
Hi, everyone. I'm Willow, and I love tea. I used to hate it, and now I love it. I cannot have caffeine, so it makes it difficult for my favorites because I love Earl Grey, and there's not really good decaf Earl Grey. And I love green tea. I used to drink over 30 ounces a day of green tea, of iced green tea. I don't really like chamomile or jasmine tea. And I'm always interested in trying new teas. I also don't like sweet teas. I feel like teas should be earthy and leafy.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I am Anne, and I do not like tea. I don't like things that taste watered down. So I'm kind of like that weird person that will not have any ice in their drinks except for water. And then I like a ton of ice.
You like your water watered down?
I like my watered down. And I do have a tolerance for a couple of teas. The Spice and Tea Company makes a really good Earl Grey cream tea and hazelnut brownie tea, which I can tolerate. And then I do like mate. So those are the only ones that I'll drink, but that's only if everybody else is having tea and I'm just kind of I should have tea, I guess. But it's not it's something that I'm oh, yes, I want a cup of tea type of situation.
Interesting. Yeah. I really like tea. I like trying different teas. I also can't do caffeine. I mean, it's not that I can't. I just prefer not to because it makes me very anxious. So I often do decaf tea. Twinings has a really good decaf English breakfast tea, which I like. That's what I'm drinking today. But they have a caffeinated Lady Grey, and that one's really good. I like that one a lot. Okay. Well, let's get into today's story. Just warning, some of the things that we talk about today might be a little bit graphic. There is trigger warnings for rape and assault. So, yeah, Willow, Anne, are there any other trigger warnings you think I should mention at this time?
Murder.
Thank you. Yes, murder. That's a good one. And I guess, I don't want to say police brutality. I don't think that's the right word, but
police misconduct.
There you go. Thank you. That's what I'm looking for. Cool. All right. So jumping into today's story, it actually starts back in 2019. When things in the world were considered normal, people were going about their business as normal. We could travel, nobody was wearing masks. And then end of 2019, in the news, we started seeing reports of something called COVID, some virus that was out there and it was spreading through China. And as things weren't locked down back then, people were still traveling to and from China to do business or just, traveling in general. And it started spreading throughout the world. And then in 2020, March 2020, the world went into lockdown. And things have eased in some places since then, have not in other places. But that's kind of where our story begins, is in 2021 during a lockdown in London. The Metropolitan Police were given the power to enforce COVID-19 regulations during that time. And I think even now, people can be arrested and fined for violating COVID-19 regulations. Event organizers can also be arrested and fined for fines even as high as £10,000, which is a lot of money. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what the climate was like at the time. So it was March 3rd, 2021. Sarah Everard was 33 years old. She was a marketing executive. And just like anyone else, she was struggling to get through, this pandemic without a lot of social interaction. So she went to a London grocery store, picked up a bottle of wine, and then walked to her friend's house in Clapham. Sorry if I mispronounced that. But before leaving her friend's house that night, she promised her friend she was going to text her when she got home safely at approximately 2100 hours, also known as 9 p.m. local time. She left her friend's house, started walking home to her house in Brixton Hill, which was about a 50-minute walk away. And at about 28 hours, 9:28, she called her boyfriend and spoke to him for 15 minutes. They made plans to meet the next day. And then that was the last anyone heard from Sarah. The friend never received a text from Sarah that night. She didn't think too much of it, just assumed that she might have forgotten to text her. It happens. And she didn't hear from her the next day either. Started getting a little worried, but again, maybe she was just busy. But then her boyfriend didn't hear from her, couldn't get a hold of her, and Sarah never showed up to meet her boyfriend. And that is when he went to the police and filed a missing persons report for Sarah. Anne, would you like to take us into what that police investigation looked like?
Yeah, so basically what ended up happening is that the police ended up really making a public plea initially to get any type of at-home footage from personal security systems, things along those lines. It was all over the news. And the police themselves actually had 1,800 hours of CCTV film footage to be able to actually go through. So they were actually able to piece together quite a bit of what happened that night through that CCTV footage, as well as eyewitness accounts. So what was really, really interesting is that most of her walk back home or getting home was actually caught by personal CCTV that was from people's home security systems that they actually had given to the police because they were actually able to see her on this footage and they were looking for her. The really key piece of evidence that was found was actually CCTV from a bus. And that initial bus saw her interacting with an unidentified male at the time. Second CCTV footage that was really important was a second bus that was actually able to capture the license plate of the vehicle of the person who was talking to her, which they were able to identify as a rental car, and they were actually able to find out who rented it. So they had an initial suspect. Looking further into the CCTV and tracking that vehicle, now that they had that information, they were actually able to find CCTV footage of them going all the way over to Dover, which is, I think, almost like a 2-hour drive, I want to say. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that where they go to the convenience store of the gas station and they end up getting snacks. And after that, they led police to a wooded area where they eventually ended up finding her body. Now, the person that became their main suspect was actually a police officer for the Metropolitan Police. And when they initially interviewed him, which you can find the footage online, at least snippets of the police interview, they ask him, have you ever seen this woman? And he's like, no. Do you know about her? And he's like, no, I don't know anything. And then they're like, well, we're here interviewing you on suspicion of kidnap. At this point, they didn't even know that she had been murdered. And he said, well, what kind of evidence do you have connecting me? Because obviously you think that I know something or know of her. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here interviewing me. And so at that point, you could see that he was trying to get the information of what they had on him already, which the interviewer basically was like, this, as you know, we're not allowed to go into details about that. But we are here to talk to you about this because we do have some type of evidence. And that's kind of when he broke down and he was like, yes, I kidnapped her because I'm actually in financial distress. I ended up I forget exactly how he phrased it, but he basically cheated a prostitute out of some of her earnings, and the gang that manages this prostitute then threatened him and said that because they cheated the girl out of her earnings and essentially their cut, that he now needed to provide them with trafficked girls to put them into prostitution. And so he basically admitted, yes, I kidnapped her to be able to traffic her to this gang because they were threatening me and my family. And he said that he met them at a very specific location and they came in a white van and they ended up pulling him out of the car, throwing him on the hood of the car, and was basically like, you did good. This is a good one. You need to continue to provide us girls. Otherwise, we're going to hurt your family. And if you don't provide us with them, we're going to kidnap your family and then traffic them into this prostitution. So he said that the days following her kidnapping, he took a bunch of days off of work because he was very emotionally distressed about the fact that these men could come and take and hurt his family, and that he hasn't been able to do anything but stay at home. Whereas the further investigation that police did, it proved that this was false. He actually ended up making a phone call to the vet's office, talking about how his dog has anxiety when they leave the home, and he was very calm and collected the entire time on this call. So it showed that
and he took his family on vacation.
And he took his family on vacation, yeah. And so it showed that the mental state that he was basically portraying during this interview was, in fact, not true. So further investigation showed that a couple of days after the kidnapping, he actually went and purchased gas at a gas station near the wooded area that her body was eventually found in, purchased a whole bunch of garbage bags. And when he purchased the gasoline, it was in what in the UK they call a jerry can, but we know them as the portable gas cans. And then it was important to be noted that when they ended up finding Sarah's body, she was wrapped up in these trash bags and she was actually thrown into a refrigerator and burned. So it's very consistent with the supplies that he got to the condition that her body was found in. So they ended up arresting him, and then they went into some trial proceedings. And then, Will, do you want to take us through that?
Yeah. So there actually is not a lot of information on the trial. And the reason why is there's an order in the UK that essentially during an active investigation, there is no information that is given to the public, or very minimal information. And this is to prevent any sort of jury that they have to be able to discuss the case and come up with their own thoughts previous to the trial. So there's actually very, very little information on the actual trial itself online. But what I did want to discuss that came out in the trial and in the investigation is all of the premeditative things that he did leading up to this act. So he is from Deal, Kent, and he visited London several times over a month. And this was to research how best to carry out his crimes. Several days before the attack, he rented a car, which he was going to use in the abduction. And he also bought handcuffs. Police issued standard handcuff keys from Amazon, and these were found in the front area of his personal vehicle. He also bought self-adhesive carpet protector film, and the film was used, but the precise purpose is not known. And 14 hairbands were also purchased on the day of the abduction. When he got the rental car, he drove it to London on the 3rd, and he parked his personal vehicle in Dover in an area where there was no houses close by. And this was most likely so that way it would lessen witnesses, and if there was any sort of resistance from the victim, in this case Sarah, when he was transferring her from the rental car into his personal vehicle. He also didn't use his own personal vehicle, and during the investigation, he said that it was because his car was malfunctioning, which is why he got a rental car. But throughout the course of the investigation, they found that his car was fine because he did transfer her from the rental into his personal car. And he also lied. He also took part of his police kit with him to London, and he lied to his family that he was working a night shift on the 3rd, and he was actually in London. And he took a different route around to get where he was going. So he was essentially like hunting a lone young female to kidnap and rape. So originally, based on the investigation and their findings, the plan wasn't to murder initially. It was just to kidnap and rape. And then it did end up resulting in a murder. So I did want to read the judge's remarks during sentencing. So the other interesting thing also that I want to mention is that in the 60s, the UK did away with capital punishment. And in 1983, what they brought back was full life term sentencing, but it is only reserved for the most heinous crimes. And there's 5 different things that 5 different reasons why a judge can use the sentencing. The jury doesn't provide this sentencing. It is the judicial arm, essentially the judge, that is able to decide if they will be using the sentencing. Since 83, there's been about 100 people that have been given this sentencing, and currently due to them passing away, there's about 60 to 70-ish currently in jail today in London and in the England and in Wales. So the judge's remarks said Sarah was 33 years of age, and she'd been working in marketing since graduating from Durham University, and she was simply walking home mid-evening, having visited a friend during the COVID pandemic. She was an intelligent, resourceful, and talented and much-loved young woman, still in her early years of life. I have not the slightest doubt that the defendant used his position as a police officer to coerce her in wholly false pretenses into the car that he hired for this purpose. It is most likely that he suggested to Sarah Everard that she had breached the restrictions on movement and that were being enforced during the stages of the pandemic. In my judgment, the misuse of police officers' role, such as occurred in this case in order to kidnap, rape, murder a lone victim, is equal seriousness as a murder carried out with the purpose of advancing political, religious, racial, or ideological causes. So she sentenced him to life with no parole. And in December, he requested an appeal. He went through the appeals process, and in December requested an appeal, which is set for May of this year, tentatively, depending on COVID and everything like that. One other interesting thing that I found was that he was also part of essentially a COVID task force when so he knew all of the protocols of when the police were stopping people for violating the COVID rules that were in place for the city. So he was very aware of like the verbiage to use and what the protocols were and things like that. And so he used this knowledge to essentially be able to coerce her and drive her 80 miles away and do what he did.
Yeah. What was interesting is that there was a couple that drove past and they saw Sarah speaking to him, mm-hmm. and they didn't stop. They didn't do anything because they just believed it was an undercover officer making a legitimate arrest. But I wonder if they had stopped, would things have turned out differently? I wonder if he would have just been like, okay, I'm going to back out because people saw me, like they're here, like, they know it's me. So that I found that very interesting, that a couple had seen them. But I mean, to be honest with you, if I saw what appeared to be a police officer arresting someone, I'm not going to stop and be like, excuse me, officer. What are you doing? It's not something that I would have done. So it is kind of scary knowing that like there really wasn't much that could be done. I mean, even if that couple had stopped, he could have just said, I'm a police officer. I need you to,
move along,
keep moving. I'm dealing with this and you're not part of this, so you need to leave. So yeah, it's definitely a very, very interesting case to read about. A lot of details that we didn't go into just because it would take far too long, I think, to go into all the details.
Oh, one thing I did want to mention that I forgot to talk about, kind of going off of if something had been done, what would have changed. So he was cited for indecent exposure. So in 2015, Kent police allegedly failed to investigate an incident of indecent exposure linked to him. And in February, so this all happened in March of 2021. So in February of 2021, he was linked to 2 allegations of indecent exposure, which the Met Police allegedly failed to investigate. And this was when he drove through a McDonald's drive-thru naked. And per the McDonald's employee, this was not the first time that he had done this. So
I think that it's also like really important to note as well, though, is that between 2015 and 2021, he actually changed departments. He was actually originally employed by the civil service to do like personal security essentially for diplomats, and that's when the indecent exposure ended up happening, and then he ended up moving departments to the Met Police. And what's important to note there too is that there's supposed to be like a very thorough vetting process, just because in the UK you like essentially aren't allowed to have a gun, and the Met Police actually are an armed force. So you have to go through a very thorough vetting process to be able to even be an armed officer. And clearly that didn't happen. The previous government agency did not even disclose that there were allegations in the first place. And so there seems to be a lot of police misconduct in that part. Just because if he had been thoroughly vetted, if he had gone through the psychological evaluation that needs to happen, things along those lines, then he may not even have been in this position of power to even commit this crime in the first place.
Yeah, and to riff off of that, it also turns out that typically when a police officer is done with their training, they go through a probationary period. And I believe I think it was supposed to be a 2-year probationary period. I can't remember the exact time, but it was something like that. And he didn't have a probationary period. So I think that's also interesting to note. Why that happened, I'm not sure. And I think that's something that would be interesting to learn about. I think also, now this was in a tabloid, so take it with a grain of salt, but it was reported in this tabloid that some of his female colleagues felt so uncomfortable around him that they had nicknamed him the rapist. So that's just interesting that had happened, given what he did to Sarah. I also think it's interesting to see how his behavior escalated, right? It slowly escalated, and obviously this was premeditated. He bought everything he needed in order to commit this crime. It's unfortunate for Sarah because he did not have a specific victim in mind. He just went out hunting. He drove around for a long time until he spotted her, and he just decided like she was going to be the one. But I think it's safe to say that if she hadn't been there, he would have found someone else. So
I think that it's also important to note when you're talking about escalation that before the indecent exposures, like the driving around naked part, there's actually a really famous DJ that said that she had an interaction with him prior to all of that where he like flashed her. And so there is like a very clear escalation of him sort of having these indecent exposures, being very, like, obviously he was also sleeping with prostitutes and things along those lines. So there is a very clear like path and escalation that ended up happening that wasn't addressed the entire time.
One thing that I found, so I did I was listening to a podcast and I didn't finish the full podcast, but I thought it was very interesting what they were talking about. It is called Fear or Favor, and it is, I believe it's a retired police officer from the UK and a prosecutor or something like that, but they are in that world. And they did talk about the escalation, right? How like exposing yourself is entry into escalating for other non-consensual acts, and that it is a power thing about forcing other people to non-consensually see you, which can lead into raping, because that is also a power thing. It's not a sex act, it's a power thing. Yeah, so very interesting things that they talked about as well regarding how the UK judicial system works, because we're in the US. And so I learned a lot about how their system works, what are the different things that they do differently than the US, things like that. Yeah, really unfortunate case. One thing I was very, very impressed by was how quickly they caught him. Like, it was days, like from...
I think that they caught him. I think he was arrested, if I remember correctly, on the 12th.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And she went missing the night of the 3rd.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very, very quickly.
But it also has to be noted that there was a huge public outcry in regards to this, just because the statistics in the UK for abuse against women is extremely high. And it was sort of the catalyst for a lot of women and women's rights, that they're like, this is another missing woman. And then as soon as it was found out that it was actually a police officer who did it, it just basically exploded from there.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of public attention. There's a lot of public outcry to begin with about this case. So I think that definitely fueled making a quick arrest and making, a lot of progress, because there was a lot of tension on this. And the fact that they ended up finding out that it was one of their own, like, a lot of times you see a little bit more caution on the police side of things. But I mean, they really kind of went for it, because I mean, a lot of CCTV ended up showing a lot of his involvement, which I think is a really interesting topic, like the whole entire Big Brother element of it, because obviously you see the good side of it, because they were able to find him and get him arrested within 10 days. But I mean, otherwise, everybody's getting recorded all the time,
Yeah, it's a little creepy.
Yeah. Yeah, but also they were able to track most of her progress through CCTV footage, right? And then using video, like from buses and from personal home security devices, that's where they were able to complete the puzzle. So I thought that was also very interesting, is that it was the buses that were driving by at that time that caught the things that really were able to push this case forward with, like, the license plate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I guess I have a question. So this was posed in one of the articles that I read while doing research. And it was like, knowing this, would it make you apprehensive if you got stopped by the police, right? About getting arrested or something like that. Because, and this was an article, or was it a video? I don't remember, but they were talking, I guess it was a video. They were talking to other women, and like, would this cause you to pause if something like this happened to you? If you were just walking alone and a cop came up to you and said, I'm arresting you.
I think living in the US, there's certain rights that you have, right? I don't know, like, I would just be apprehensive in any other country, because I don't know how their legal system works. I don't really know, like, what rights you have.
Mm-hmm.
But being in the US, I remember when I was a kid, like in the 90s, I heard a story about how sometimes people would dress up as police officers and pretend to be a police officer to get you to do things. So I was always taught, if someone, if a police officer is going to arrest you, or whatever it may be, you can call 911 and say, hey, this is happening. Can you please verify that this officer is actually authorized to do this? If not, please send police. So I think if it's during the day, I probably wouldn't be as apprehensive. At night, I would probably be a little bit more apprehensive, just because there's less people around. And not knowing if it really is a police officer or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think definitely time of day would have an impact on that.
I think that's also really important to note that he actually was not in uniform. He was actually in plain clothes. And there's actually a lot of plainclothes officers in the UK, whereas in the United States, like, it's not as common. Like, when you have undercover officers in plain clothes, it's usually for a very specific, like, sting type of operation, So it's not something that you would interact with very often. So I feel like the situation's a little bit different. And I know that there were actually a lot of changes that ended up happening in regards to plainclothes officers even approaching women in the UK after this case. They're actually instructed, if a plainclothes officer is going to be approaching a woman, then they actually do need to record it and like let them know that it's going to be recorded. And they do have the option of calling in to be able to verify like their identity. Which for me, I find also kind of interesting because like if there are like a lot of plainclothes officers, I would think that if they're going to arrest somebody, they would have some type of like identification. Now, I'm not very familiar with that whole entire process, so there might be something that I don't know about, but it would be interesting to sort of know that, because I know that here in the United States, when somebody is identifying themselves as a police officer, they actually have to like show their badge. And that's like an important part of the process too.
So Sarah's killer did show a card that he had. I guess police officers would get cards showing that they have the power to arrest you based on the violation of COVID-19 regulations. And he did show her that card. So that is something to note. So it did look very, very legitimate. And I think that's why she complied. Yeah. That's why I'm like, I really believe that someone was going to be murdered that day. He was going to murder someone that day. It was just unfortunate that it was Sarah, but if it hadn't been her, it would have been someone else.
Yeah. It's such a sad case. And he tried to use depression as one of the reasons. And the judge was like, you can be depressed, but depression does not equal the heinous crimes that you committed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Reading the whole judge's sentencing was very interesting because it goes through everything. I mean, and we could sit here for hours talking about like what the trial was and what the judge said and what he did and all that stuff. The other interesting thing that I found was sentencing took 2 days, and the family, so her parents and her sister, were able to read their victim impact statements. And one of the really sad things that I think her dad said was that he took away for them being able to say goodbye to her because he burned her. So they couldn't see her face and say goodbye for one last time.
That's really sad.
Yeah. So it was really, really sad, like reading through that too.
Yeah, that is really sad.
I find it interesting that they've started, I don't know if they've started doing that, but started releasing the witness impact or the victim impact statements.
Yeah, the victim impact statements. I think it's good. In some way, shape, or form. I don't know how I would feel if I was on the other side. But I think it shows the impact of what these heinous crimes do. Right? Like and that's one of the things that the judge talked about. It was not only did you kill this girl, this woman, you also have taken her away from her family. You've taken her away from her friends. You've taken her away from loved ones. You have impacted your family. Now your wife and your child have been impacted by this and who have nothing to do with anything. Now you've impacted them. You've also impacted the police department as a whole and the public, because now the public does not trust the police department based on your actions. And so not only did you kill this woman, you have impacted the whole world, essentially, based like a very large population just based on you killing this one person. So, and she went through like very detailed as to like what the impacts were of what he did.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also assuming the judge is a woman. I don't know why, but I actually didn't look up the judge's name, but yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of concern, right, from women being like, hey, like, we don't feel safe because this happened to Sarah. Even before they found her body, they were saying that they didn't feel safe. It kind of echoed, there were similarities, right? How this girl went missing to the 70s with, I believe it was Jack the Ripper, and how, I mean, it was prostitutes going missing back then, I believe. But still, right? It's women weren't safe to be out at night. And something that the police department released while they were still investigating the case was telling women that they should just stay at home and not go out after 10 p.m. in order to stay safe. And a lot of women felt that was not right. It's like, why do we need to stay home? Why don't, if there's a threat out there, why don't we make that threat? And a lot of women turned that to men and said men should have to stay home after 10 p.m. so that we are not threatened. Yeah. So that, like, why do we have to stay at home? Make men stay at home. So interesting about that is that everyone automatically assumed it was a man, but women can also murder women. And I think it's one of those things. It was, and the reason why there was so much outrage is because back in the 70s when Jack the Ripper was at large, and
Jack the Ripper is from the late 1800s.
Oh, who was the guy from the 70s? They called him the Ripper.
Still 1870, but yeah. But it was the new Ripper because he was also targeting women, prostitutes, and slitting their throats just like Jack the Ripper.
Okay, so then maybe it was a copycat or something.
The Ripper.
Okay, so it was the Ripper.
Oh, Yorkshire Ripper.
There you go. That was it. Yorkshire Ripper.
Yorkshire Ripper.
Thank you. Yeah, and so they, police had said like women should stay home, and I think part of the outrage was, how is it that was the advice back in the 70s, and now here we are, well into 2000s, and we're still giving the same advice, right? It's like, why haven't we found a better way to protect people? And I think part of that does fall on the police department, but I think part of that also falls on people individually. It's like, what do you do to make yourself feel safe? Like, what are you doing to protect yourself? And, are you aware of bad areas? Like, I'm not going to walk into a bad neighborhood at night. I mean, I'm probably not going to walk into a bad neighborhood, period, even if it's like middle of the day, but definitely not at night, right? There's just certain areas that hey, this is dangerous. I'm probably not going to hang out here. So yeah, it was interesting seeing the outrage, and the response that different people had, women, police officers, even like concerned, I guess, men or other genders, so, I
also think, that not only is it on you to be able to protect yourself, but also if you see something, say something, right? And not just like someone else will take care of it and walk by. Mm-hmm. Because I think I have noticed anyways that typically the person that is going to like step in if something bad is happening, like if I'm being harassed or something like that, someone that normally steps in is normally another woman. So, and they'll be like, hey girl, how's it going? Like, long time no see, whatever, right? And to be able to take the attention away and like, and get you out of the situation. And I don't know if that's because men don't feel comfortable sometimes, like approaching, they don't know what's going on. They don't want to get in a fight. I don't know why it is that men typically don't step in, but I've noticed it's a lot of women that do step in. Well, not a lot, but I'm saying like in my experience, when you see a woman that is obviously like not okay or feels uncomfortable, I feel like it's normally another woman that steps in and is like, hey, how's it going? Like, what are you doing? Let's come over here. And then just be like, are you okay? Is everything okay? Do you need help?
So I think that is interesting. It's an interesting observation, but I think part of it has to do with, one, a lot of women feel like men that approach them are creepy, right? You're sitting at a bar and a guy is approaching you. You're not going to be like, oh, he wants to be my friend. No, he probably does not want to just be your friend, but if a girl approaches you at a bar, you're like, oh, okay, cool. Like whatever. You don't have that guard up, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's difficult for men to kind of step in because it's like, am I going to seem like creepy? Am I even going to make this girl feel better at all by stepping in? Like, or am I just making the situation worse? Number two, I think it's easier for women to identify when a female is feeling uncomfortable, right? Because we've all been in that situation where you're just like, help, right? And you're kind of like, and you're just kind of like looking around. And I think it's like men might not catch that, right? Because I'm not going to say they're never in that situation, but it's not a situation
common enough for them.
Yeah, right. I think it happens so much more to women that it's easier for women to identify when another woman needs help or is in trouble. And I think it's a little bit more comforting turning to a woman and being like, help me, because you think you'll know that they'll understand. But if you turn to a guy, like they might just, you don't know how they're going to react, right? They might just be like, what? Who are you?
And so this is actually super evident because there's that huge like TikTok trend that was going around where these women's were doing the little quick side glances to be able to show like the different types of side glances that you can get. Like, I'm in an uncomfortable situation, or this person's really attractive, or, oh my gosh, what did they just say? And I think that it also shows that women are a little bit more trained to be able to distinguish those nonverbal micro expressions that we use to be able to communicate with one another. And it was interesting because all of, like, if you were looking at the comments, the women were like, oh yeah, like I totally got that, blah, blah, blah. And if you were looking at like the men's comments, they're like, I don't see a difference. And so
that's interesting.
It was really interesting.
Because I have seen a lot of those videos and I cannot tell what the heck these women are trying to say with their eyes. I've never been able to. I'm always like, I don't know. Like, I can tell that there's a difference between the looks, but I cannot tell you what that look itself means. I think it's because I don't really look just at the person's face, like help, or like, their eye glance or whatever. It's about the entire body language, right? If a person, like if I see a girl and she's kind of like rigid, like you could tell, okay, she's anxious. It's just natural things that you do, right? When you feel uncomfortable, your muscles are going to tighten up. Maybe your breathing's a little bit faster. Right. You're kind of like looking around. Yeah. You're like leaning back, trying to like kind of stay away there. It's more than just like a look. I think it's interesting that women could tell. I couldn't tell from those videos personally. But I know there were some other women that could tell. They're just like, oh yeah, like that's obviously blah, blah. I was like, really? Like, how can you tell? But again, I think that's also how men feel, where they're just like, I did not get that. So yeah, I don't think we can fault anyone for like not stepping in. And I think Sarah's case is actually a very, very, prime example that you could do everything right. She said she was going to text a friend. She talked to her boyfriend on the phone. Like she did everything she could to keep herself safe. She obviously felt safe walking by herself, and things still went wrong. And, it's just sometimes things are going to go wrong, and you just have to understand that even if you do everything right, things can still go wrong. Sometimes it's just not preventable. Yeah.
Yeah. Because he also took all those steps to make it look legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and you can't. Yeah. She probably legitimately thought that she was doing
She was
something.
being arrested.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can't imagine like the fear and the anxiety that she felt when she realized that this is not real.
Yeah. I think just being in that car and being driven away, it's like, that's probably when she started realizing, like, oh, we've been driving for a while. Like, this
80
is not
miles
good.
away. Yeah.
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 Well, we are coming up on our time here. So I am going to leave everyone with this closing question. What is one thing that you do to make yourself feel safer in this world?
So this is Willow. For me, I try to take out the variables that are in my control. So, for example, there's a walk that I have to do occasionally, and because it's wintertime, it's very dark, and there's not a lot of light in that section of when I have to walk to my car. So I bought a small camping light, and it's very bright. And I turn that on before I start my walk. So that way it illuminates everything. I can see all that stuff, right? And that makes me feel more comfortable because that takes out that sort of variable. When I'm walking by people, I make eye contact and say hello. So I do little things to like the things that I can control. I try to take out those variables out and try to make myself feel as comfortable as possible with what I can control.
Nice.
Hi, this is Anne. I do something very similar. But for me, it's also simple things like as soon as I get into the car, I lock the door.
Mm-hmm.
Or as soon as I get home, I lock the door. Or if I'm making multiple trips from the car to the house, I'm locking the door each time so that I'm not like leaving the front door unattended and somebody can come in. I'm not like leaving windows open when I leave the house. Just things like that where I feel like I'm trying to take every single precaution that I can to make sure that I'm not leaving things unsecured and leaving myself in a situation where something could potentially bad happen.
Nice. That's really good. I think I personally, I tried looking when I go into a place, I try kind of looking at the exit points, look around, look at the people that are around me. I'm like, what are the chances that someone's going to help me? Probably low, but occasionally, like, you will see people that are a little bit more aware. Yeah, just kind of understanding and knowing your surroundings. Doing simple things like not parking in dark spots, finding where like those lampposts are and parking underneath that because you know that the sun's going to be going down soon. Things like that. And honestly, I think the biggest thing is letting go of that ego. And when you're like, oh man, I could either ask for help or just try to be brave and like run to my car now that it's parked in like a dark area. It's like sometimes it's just about letting that ego go and going back into the store or wherever you just came from and being like, hey, do you mind actually walking out with me? Like, I just don't feel comfortable walking by myself. And typically someone will be willing to help you out. So yeah. And I personally have taken like self-defense classes and done taking like jujitsu classes, which taught me that it's something you really have to like keep up on, because if you don't, it is a skill, it's like any skill. If you don't use it, you will lose it. So it's not something that I've kept up on, but I do know like some basic skills and just keeping up with my fitness. Cause if I can't run away, then how far can you actually get? So, but yeah, just doing things that I enjoy and making that part of my like safety plan. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of different things that I do to make myself feel safe. And like Willow said, just trying to control the controllables and not worrying about the uncontrollables because you can't control those.
Yeah. And I 100% agree with you on asking for help, because there have been times where I've been in bad situations and I ran up to someone and I was like, I'm being followed. I need your help. And he was like, 100% I'm here. And so, yeah, asking for that help, I think, does go a long way because people are willing to help. They might not be willing to step in, but they typically are willing to help if you ask for it.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this episode. I know it was a little bit darker than we usually do, but we do appreciate you sticking through it. And we would love to hear your answers to the question of the day or our closing question. And of course, any thoughts you have on this case, please feel free to let us know. Until next time, we'll see you at the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Bye.